Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and we have a lot packed in. As a matter of fact, I think we tried to maybe pack too much into these 2 hours, but we will do our best. As a matter of fact, let me just maybe mention some of the things we aren't going to talk about today, but we'll talk about tomorrow. A couple of very important Supreme Court decisions that have come down that will affect you and your family and your elections. Supreme Court, I should say, upheld the Arizona voting restrictions that were implemented by the Republican legislature. That tells me, and we will spend maybe some more talking about that tomorrow with Penna Dexter as well as with Dr. Merrill Matthews about the implications of that for example, the justice lawsuit against the state of Georgia in terms of election reform and the impact that could have on other legislatures trying to have some kind of restrictions on voting. So we will cover that tomorrow. There is a case also that came out of California which struck down the mandating, I guess would be a better way to say that, of donor information that the Attorney General in California wanted to have. And this is a case actually that Kelly Shackelford filed a brief with, because we know what happens when you release the names of people that donate to a particular proposition or candidate. If they want to release it, that is fine, but sometimes what happens is they get doxxed, they get fired, they are actually picketed against, and a variety of other things. I fully believe in transparency, but also recognize what has happened to a number of very unfortunate people whose names, information were actually exposed. So we'll talk about many of those cases tomorrow, because the Supreme Court is winding down, which means your rights are secure for a couple months before they reconvene back there in October. Also, as a program note, let me just mention about a half an hour from now, we will have Reggie Littlejohn with us. She is kind of our go-to expert on what's happening in China and seeming to move away a little bit from the one-child policy, but maybe not really, but also has some really strong comments to make about vaccine passports, as this could be a gateway to mass surveillance. When you see what is already happening in China, this illustrates why we should be concerned about some of these issues here in the United States. So we will certainly spend some time talking with her. Next hour, Lucas Miles will be with us. I was supposed to interview him at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, but his book is so good, rather than just pulling together a very short interview with him, we're going to give him an hour on his very excellent book called The Christian Left, How Liberal Thought Has Hijacked the Church. And in any of these particular events, if you would like to join us, feel free to give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. And let me also mention a couple of other things. We will probably talk about the New York election tomorrow as well. John Fund wrote a wonderful piece, and it starts out, I love this. For decades, the American Idol and Eurovision TV talent shows have calculated millions of votes during commercial breaks with barely a hitch. But it only took a few hours this week for New York City, the largest city in the United States, to demonstrate just how incompetent local election bureaucrats can be. And that is certainly the case. So, first of all, John Fund wrote that. He is actually going to be on with Dr. Merrill Matthews, because speaking of New York, this time next week, I guess I'm in Vermont, but then I'll be in New York, and so we'll be talking about some of those issues, and he will be talking about that while I happen to be out doing some speaking. But while I'm talking about New York, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you have probably heard that the Manhattan District Attorney, Cy Vance, has actually brought a suit against the entire Trump organization. Just the other day, the lawyer for the Trump organization, Ron Fischetti, actually spent an hour and a half trying to explain to them that this really would not be a good idea, a criminal indictment against the company, because that's different than indicting an individual. And our friend Andrew McCarthy, who's also been a federal prosecutor, starts his piece today saying, "Sometimes I wonder if Democrats are trying to get Donald Trump reelected president." Well, we'll leave that there, but But if you find yourself in some kind of conversation with people saying, I just told you Donald Trump was a crook and all the rest, a lot of it has to do with something that does not necessarily have anything to do with Donald Trump or his family, has some to do with one of the individuals in his organization. And so Mr. Weisenberg, who, by the way, 73 years of age, actually allowed his son to use Trump's apartment at little or no cost, cars leased for the family, tuition, free parking, those kinds of things. And even the Associated Press said, look, there's nothing illegal about companies providing lavish perks to valued employees, but in many circumstances, those benefits count as compensation due to income tax. And that's where, again, the lawyer just a minute ago, Ron Fischetti, said, look, we've looked back 100 years of cases. We haven't found a single one where an employee has been indicted for fringe benefits, certainly not a corporation. And so by focusing on the corporation rather than the individual, and by making this a big story, I suspect, as you probably have guessed by now, this wouldn't have been a real big story if, of course, it did not indirectly affect the former president of the United States. And because so many people in the media dislike Donald Trump, a story about whether particular benefits are taxable or not taxable doesn't rise quite yet to the kind of things that we hear from the press. But if indeed there turn out to be allegations that something in Donald Trump's organization, his family, or others have violated actual tax laws, well, we'll report those as well. But at the moment, it, I think, illustrates again that any time you can put the word Trump next to a particular investigation, the press is quite willing to do that. Let's now go to a couple of the articles I've posted. We're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about critical race theory, but the first article is by Clifford May, and I love it, because he says if critical race theory is correct, is America even worth defending? And he's quoting from Mark Milley, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who was talking about the fact that I need to get a little smarter about reading about these ideas of critical race theory. And so, again, he says, well, how does one become more smart about these issues? And then it begins to remind us of all the things that have been done and why some people have expressed concerns. For example, on the second page, he talks about how there were slides about white power at West Point. Then you have some people looking at some of the various ways in which this has been taught. Third and fourth page talk about some of the influence of Karl Marx in the theory, and Ibram X. Kendi, a very prominent critical race theory proponent, and then Derek Bell, who also has been an advocate of critical race theory. So after you work your way through 5 pages of pretty good evidence of some really significant things that might cause some people some concern about the teaching and indoctrination of critical race theory, Clifford May ends with this. If General Milley is to get smarter about critical race theory, he will need to understand such things. He'll also need to grapple with this question. Why should young people, of whatever color, serve in the armed forces and risk their lives to defend the failed experiment that critical race theory alleges America is and has always been? Because if you indeed believe that this is a nation not worth defending, why go to the recruiting office and sign up? It's a good question. It's our first article on the website. We have a lot more to cover. We will do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Are single-parent families just as good for children as two-parent families? Some of the headlines recently in newspapers and news magazines seem to say so. But all you have to do is look back at academic studies to see that, in nearly every case, two parents are better than one. One older family study deserves renewed attention. Dr. Patrick Fagan, using data from the National Survey of Children's Health, found 2 important factors. Children who grow up in an intact family and attend religious services do better than children who do not. There is a significant discrepancy between children who grew up in intact two-parent families and those who came from broken homes. They also found a similar discrepancy between those who attend religious services weekly and those who worship less frequently. They found that children in the former groups were 5 times less likely to repeat a grade, less likely to have behavior problems at home and school, and more likely to be cooperative and understanding of others' feelings. They also found that these differences held true even after controlling for family income and poverty, as well as for the parents' education level, race, and ethnicity. In essence, the study suggests that the best prescription for society is a stable family and family worship. In this environment, children thrive emotionally and achieve academically. You know, in a sense, the study is a flip side of studies that were published years ago about the impact of divorce on children. In my book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language, I talk about the 3 E's of negative impact of divorce. That would be emotional impact, educational impact, and economic impact. So whether you look at these positive studies or the earlier negative studies, you can see the importance of family and worship. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In fact, once again, we're going to have a number of guests in just a minute, but let me get to a couple of other issues that I thought we might put on the table. We were talking about this issue of critical race theory, and I've been mentioning over the last couple of weeks that there is going to be more and more of a pushback against any of what you might call anti-CRT rules. We understand that because you have parents and educators standing up at school boards, as we talked about yesterday with Robert Knight. You have various legislatures that are actually banning the teaching of this, which, by the way, if I can inject my own opinion in this for just a moment, probably not a very good idea. I mean, I believe in the First Amendment, and even this last week, being at the National Religious Broadcasters, everybody from David French to Ken Starr and a variety of others said, you know, they really had some hesitation about these laws. One, because we believe in the First Amendment. Yes, you have the freedom to teach even bad theology, but I think we should take that up then with the school boards and the administrators and things like that. You have the right to teach even these kinds of ideas, but we also have the right to tell you whether or not we think that that's something that should be part of your lesson plan. But trying to have a legislature cut off of the free flow of intellectual discussion, especially at the college level, I think is a misnomer. Second of all, as some people pointed out, sometimes doesn't actually ban it anyway. And even if you do ban it, I mentioned just the other day, we have 4,000 teachers that have now signed a petition saying they are planning on teaching it, even if it's declared illegal by the legislature. So we'll see where that plays out. But anyway, back to the point. Rich Lowry has a piece that came out today, and we may talk more about it tomorrow, but he says the misleading attacks on the anti-CRT rules, and quotes from 2 individuals. One is a Professor Timothy Snyder, and then a person writing for The Atlantic. I thought I would just put this down for just a minute before I get to our second article we've posted by John Stossel, just to help you understand that when you see something written, Timothy Snyder writing in the New York Times Magazine and Applebaum writing in The Atlantic, even though they say these things, they're just factually incorrect. And you wish that there would be some fact checkers out there with the same kind of diligence when people make inaccurate, false, maybe even deceptive statements and get away with it. But nevertheless, we will give full credit to Rich Lowry. He points out the fact that Ann Applebaum says that school children, according to this, should not be taught the history of racism in America. They should not learn about slavery. They should not be allowed to think about the long-term consequences, and then makes disparaging comments about conservatives, Republicans, everybody else. And Rich Lowry says, not to put too fine a point on this line of attack by anti-CRT bills is either woefully misinformed or willfully dishonest. I'll let you figure out if she just doesn't know what she's talking about or she's just very dishonest. I think the latter, given her educational background, because he points out that Ann Applebaum doesn't even provide an example of the alleged campaign to erase slavery and racism from the nation's curriculum, even though there's already been quite a bit about that. And if you look at the actual text of these provisions, this is nothing more, he says, than a historical smear. Okay, how about Professor Timothy Snyder? He talks about the fact that the new anti-CRT rule adopted by Florida and by their state school board, he says it's kind of like Russia's memory law to silence a history of suffering, to forbid education about racism. And again, Rich Lowry says either Snyder doesn't know what he's talking about because he hasn't taken the time to understand the state of play in Florida, or else he's being deliberately deceptive. The rule adopted by Florida board says in a passage that Snyder conveniently doesn't quote. Notice how they don't quote some of this. Quote, this is what's in the law, or actually the provision by the state board. Instruction on the required topics must be factual and objective, may not suppress or distort significant historical events such as the Holocaust, slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, Civil Rights Movement, and the contributions of women, African American, and Hispanic people to our country. Doesn't exactly look like North Korea, China, Soviet Union, even Nazi Germany, whatever example you want to use. And just a good example as well that when you hear somebody trying to smear somebody expressing some concern about something like critical race theory, many times they either are woefully ignorant, which is a possibility, but both these people are very bright, or just deliberately deceptive. And I'm always up for a fair and honest discussion, but ad hominem arguments and leaving out relevant information isn't exactly contributing to the ongoing discussion about our nation's past and, most importantly, our nation's future. But for those of you that want to look ahead to the Supreme Court, there is an upcoming case having to do with the Second Amendment. And John Stossel's piece, which is the second one we've posted here, is one for those of you interested in this to read, because he talks about both Robert Nash and Brandon Koch, our coach, however he pronounces his name, but nevertheless, they were in the state of New York and denied gun permits because they hadn't demonstrated a special need. Well, John Stossel, I know, as a matter of fact, has also gone down this same road. I mean, a number of years ago, he wanted to try to get a carry permit in New York. So he said, first, I filled out 60 pages of instructions about irrelevant things like metal knuckle knives and kung fu stars, filled out a confusing 17-page form, got it notarized, went to the police department in person. They fingerprinted me, demanded reasons why I should be allowed to have a gun, and charged me $430. Heard nothing from them for a year and a half. Then they finally wrote me and said it was denied. I called and asked if I could appeal, he said. They said I could try again if I could prove that a special need existed to carry a gun. He says, after years of confronting crooks on TV, I actually do have a special need for self-protection. I showed the cops threats to my life. Not good enough. They turned me down. Found out later that the people that did get a permit almost always were bribing the cops. Well, this case is now going to be involved with these two individuals. And Alan Gottlieb, who is with the Second Amendment Foundation, says that because of this, this may be one of the most significant cases the Supreme Court could rule on, because, first of all, we have, as he points out, more originalist judges on the court. And this will, I think, also be very helpful to many individuals who have not been able to legally obtain a firearm. For example, the argument is almost always made that this is going to make us less safe, and of course John Stossel gives you a couple of those quotes, but 58% of new gun owners are African American, 40% of new gun owners are women. Why? Because of the concerns that they have about where the society is going. Alan Gottlieb says an awful lot of women bought a firearm to protect themselves and feel a lot safer. 800,000 times a year a person uses a firearm to protect themselves. If you call 911, the police usually get there after the crime is over. And so one of the things that John Stossel points out in this piece, over the last decades, most states liberalized their gun laws. Most allow concealed carry. Gun control advocates predicted this would lead to an epidemic of shootings. Of course, it has not. And Alan Gottlieb makes the statement that an armed society oftentimes is a polite society. So you're going to continue to hear kind of a drumbeat both ways, certainly from the Biden administration, but this is a case going to the Supreme Court. These two individuals were denied gun permits in the state of New York, and the Supreme Court is going to hear the case, and so we'll kind of follow that in the future. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking about what's happening in China, and then we'll also look ahead to some of the concerns she's expressed, along with others, about this idea of vaccine passports and how that could be a gateway to mass surveillance. So we'll get her perspectives on that. I'm not ignoring the fact that former President Donald Trump was at the southern border yesterday. By the way, instead of going to El Paso, as the Vice President Kamala Harris went to, he went to the Rio Grande Valley, which is actually kind of the epicenter of illegal immigration. And of course, there are all sorts of issues that surfaced out of that conversation and some of the presentation by the governor of the state of Texas, Greg Abbott. So we'll probably again postpone a lot of those discussions till tomorrow. If nothing else, hope that will cause you to tune in, because over the next about 90 minutes, we're going to interview two very smart people who I think will educate us on some very important issues. If you find yourself saying, okay, I'd like to read a little bit more about this, these articles are posted on the website, along with the statement by Reggie Littlejohn about the issue of the one-child policy being changed. Also a second one about this initiative to stop vaccine passports. And then, of course, we also have information about the book, The Christian Left, How Liberal Thought Has Hijacked the Church. And so those are all resources available at our website, pointofview.net. So I just wanted to give you a chance to find some of those. My Viewpoints commentary today is about the importance of intact families and some of the great social research in that regard. But let's take a break. We'll talk about China, talk about vaccine passports, and much more right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's see if we can talk a little bit about what's going on in China. The one-child policy, we've heard about a two-child policy, even a three-child policy. What does that mean? And a lot of misconceptions there. So, of course, we want to talk about that. And then also, one of the other articles we've posted, we have a statement by Reggie Littlejohn that you can find. We also have another statement about stop vaccine passports, that it could be a gateway to mass surveillance. So we have a link to, of course, the organization Women's Rights Without Frontiers, as well as a couple of other articles. And Reggie Littlejohn's been on the program with us many times before, president of Women's Rights Without Frontiers, a graduate of Yale Law School, probably the best expert we have ever talked with on the one-child policy. They also are involved in saving lives. They have a Save a Girl campaign, which you can find as you go to their website, a Save a Widow campaign as well. And we'll talk about some of those programs. And most importantly, welcome back to the microphone, Reggie Littlejohn.
Oh, Kerby, thank you for having me back. It's always such a pleasure to speak with you.
We've been talking with you for many, many years, haven't you? I mean, you have been a good friend of this ministry. And, of course, back when we first started talking to you, we were talking about a one-child policy. But one of the things that we've posted here is where the Wall Street Journal actually was quoted as saying that the Chinese Communist Party is considering the possibility of ending all birth restrictions in the year 2025. But you have a lot of disclaimers to that statement, not the least of which is just because the Chinese Communist Party says it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. But what do we need to know about that?
Well, there's a couple things that we need to know about that. Number one, when China shifted from a one-child policy to a two-child policy, they continued with forced abortion. Okay, so the two-child policy and the three-child policy, they both say every couple is allowed to have either two children or now three children. And what that means is that single women have continued to be forcibly aborted. And according to one statistic cited by Radio Free Asia last year, China typically aborts 8 million what they call extra pregnancies. So these would be illegal pregnancies. And I believe that most of those are of single women. So even under the three-child policy, single women are going to continue to be forcibly aborted. And when they say that they're thinking of getting rid of all coercive birth limits in 2025, what's the new rule going to be? That all couples can have as many kids as they want? Or are they going to say, are they going to continue to forcibly abort single mothers? That's the first question. Another question is that right now the Chinese Communist Party is committing genocide against the Uyghurs in Xinjiang.
Yes. Through
forced abortion, forced sterilization, infanticide, and they have in turn put between 1 and 3 million people into basically what amounts to forced labor or even concentration camps. And one of the main reasons they have put them in there has been that they've had, quote unquote, too many children, meaning more than 2 children. So number one, are they going to release those people under the three-child policy? Everyone who's in there because they have 3 kids, now they have a 3-child policy, they need to be released and their children restored to them. And also, if they're going to get rid of all birth limitations in 2025, is that going to apply to the Uyghur minorities? Are they going to let them have as many children as they want?
So again, you've got all sorts of issues simultaneously surfacing, one for Chinese people at large and then the Uyghurs as well. But if nothing else, let's spend a moment talking about what you've been dealing with for some time, because when people go to your website, they can see that there's a Save a Girl outreach and Save a Widow campaign, which are to help some of these destitute widows in rural China. But it doesn't take more than just a click to go to your website to see some of the just horrendous things that some of these women have gone through with forced abortions. Can you talk to that issue?
Well, yes. I mean, this is the other thing, is that unfortunately, because of son preference, when they up the number of kids that couples are allowed to have, the numbers of girls who are aborted goes up. It goes up. Because, for example, under the one-child policy, there was a couple that had one kid, and she was a girl, and they figured that they were one and done. When they opened it up to a two-child policy, the husband said, let's have another kid, but let's make sure it's a boy. And he forced his wife to abort 4 baby girls in a year, and she died. And so the gender side, the sex-selective abortion of baby girls is continuing, no matter how many kids you're allowed to have. So we have something called Save a Girl Campaign, and we are the only organization in the world that has boots on the ground inside of rural China that is helping save baby girls from sex-selective abortion, abandonment, and then also just grinding poverty. And we're also saving widows. But we have field workers who are very brave, who can go to the doors of these women and just say, congratulations on your baby girl. Girls are as good as boys, and we will give you a monthly stipend of $25 in yuan, their currency, to help you keep your baby daughter. And what that does is it enables these women to go to their husbands and to their mothers-in-law, who are the ones who are usually pressuring them to abort or abandon the girl, and say, I can't abort or abandon this baby girl. Look, she's a lucky girl. She's already bringing money into the family. And we have saved about 300 baby girls so far in that way.
And again, a great way to combat gendercide, also to feed impoverished baby girls. And just before I take a break, because then I want to get into this whole issue of vaccine passports, let's just look at it from China's point of view for a minute, because they have tried to prevent an exploding population from their mindset. And so they have the most coercive population control restrictions anywhere. But then you point out in the statement that we've posted for people to read and then post on their Facebook page if they'd like, that when they move from a one-child policy to a two-child policy, they didn't exactly get a baby boom, did they?
No, they didn't. Okay, so what happened is, in the first year, they got a little bump up because all the people who wanted to have a second child had a second child right away under the two-child policy, and then it just, the fertility rate just plummeted after that. So that's why I think they're moving into a three-child policy. But I don't think the three-child policy is going to be any more successful than the two-child policy. They have been so successful in brainwashing and browbeating people into believing that one kid is the right number, that now that they are in a desperate situation because of their aging population, they are not able to encourage people to have more kids. And actually, I'm worried that they're going to start practicing forced procreation.
Yes.
To force people to have kids. That is something that can't be taken off the table because of the coercive nature of their character.
I just knew we were going to get to that because, the idea of forced pregnancy, amazing. But just before we take a break, let's also talk about very quickly that what we have here is a situation where you have many more young boys and now even young adults, men, that are existing and very few women. And so this has affected not only marriage, but prostitution and a variety of other things in China, hasn't it?
Right, Kirby. So every year, the United States comes out with something called the Trafficking in Person Report, the TIP report, which tracks and rates countries everywhere in the world according to human trafficking and sexual slavery. And China is for the last couple of years has been ranked as a tier 3 nation, which means that they are in the worst. They are among the worst nations in terms of human trafficking. And I believe that the reason for that is that they have got somewhere between 30 and 40 million men who will never find wives because their future wives were aborted before they were born. And they know that, and so they turn a blind eye to human trafficking and sexual slavery and forced brides because they know that if they actually enforce that, then they would have an insurrection on their hands. So this is a terrible situation. There are many, many millions of women who are trafficked and in horrific situations of being forced brides in China because of the one-child policy. This is part of the fallout of the one-child policy.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about surveillance. You know, this booklet that I wrote quite some time ago about privacy and surveillance is one that I want to update, in part because of some of the things that have happened over this last year in terms of the pandemic and the lockdown and surveillance and the rest. And one of the things that we wanted you to also know about is that Reggie Littlejohn is one of those individuals who has drafted an open letter to the president warning about the dangers of vaccine passports. If you understand how in some cases surveillance is being used in China, you can understand that if China has its own digital currency, by the way, they've kicked out all the Bitcoin miners out of the country, having their own currency, they can actually be able to follow what you do in terms of what you spend. But what about these vaccine passports? That's something we've talked about a little bit, and certainly could be used and are being used in the social credit system of China. So we're going to spend some time talking about that with Reggie Littlejohn, and perhaps you have some comments about that. 1-800-351-1212. We'll continue our conversation with her right after this.
Now, back to Point of View
your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, Reggie Littlejohn with us, and one of the press releases that just came out, Stop Vaccine Passports Leaders Launch Initiative. We have that on the website, pointofview.net. Of course, you can also go to a website called stopvaxpassports.org. Don't even necessarily need to remember all that because those links can be found in this article. And I think, Reggie, you can help us perhaps more than anyone else, although I might mention that other people that have signed this letter that you have sent out is one that includes all sorts of people that we've had on this program, people like Frank Gaffney and Eric Metaxas, and the list goes on of individuals that we've interviewed that are very concerned. But you have a unique opportunity to educate us because of seeing what has happened in China through this social credit system. Can you educate us?
Kerby, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to do this, and you should know that this is my first interview because this just went out today, so you guys have the first one. Yes. So concerning the China social credit system, I just want to say that we launched this initiative today, July 1st, 2021, because today is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party.
Yes. Okay.
They took over in 1949, but they formed in 1921. And so they are trying to export their system of surveillance all over the world. So they have something called the China Social Credit System. And what that is it's an app or a series of apps that's on their phone where they track everything about you. And they come up with a score to decide how much freedom you're going to have. So what do they track? They have facial recognition. They have gait recognition. How everybody has a certain way that they walk. So they have facial and gait recognition. All of your spending is tracked. Your social media posts. So if you say something that's positive or negative about the regime, that is tracked. And then your bank account is attached. Your credit cards are attached. Your entire medical history is attached. And so what do they do with all that information? They decide whether you are a good citizen or a bad citizen. So if you have a high social credit score, you can lead a normal life. So you can buy a home, you can borrow money, you can send your kids to a good school, you can travel. If you are like a subservient citizen of the regime, you can have what looks like a pretty normal life. But if you're not, like if for example, you're a dissident or if you criticize the regime, then your social credit score goes right down, and then you can't borrow money, you can't travel, you can't get your kids into a good school, you can lose your job, and if you're a real dissident, like some of the heroic people that we know, like Chung Guan-Chen or somebody like that, then you can be disappeared because it's all geolocation. They know exactly where you are. They know exactly what you look like. They know who you've been talking to. They know who your friends are, who your network is, and they can just any dissident in China can be found within a matter of minutes and then never heard from again. So that is terrifying. It is a tool of totalitarianism. And my concern with the vaccine passport, and what I'm talking about here is not a paper certificate. It's the digital one that goes on your phone. All right, is that according to tech experts, and I'm citing here. I mean, there's Naomi Wolf, who's been sort of out on the front lines with this, but then there's also a person named Jay Valentine who developed the fraud software, the fraud detection software for eBay. They say that the functionality on the vaccine passport, that all these things can be incorporated into it and it could function exactly the same as the China social credit system. So once they have this digital passport in place, which looks very innocent, it's like, she's vaccinated or she's not vaccinated. That's just the beginning because all the rest of it can be attached to it, and in the wrong hands, it could be used to usher in totalitarian control. So that's what I and others are raising the alarm about.
Excellent. Again, my booklet on privacy and surveillance maybe gives you a background on the debate in the past, because I quote some individuals we've had on the program that said, oh, Big Brother isn't watching you. You know, when we passed the Patriot Act, that wasn't really the case. Now we're starting to find out there was a whole lot more surveillance than people knew, and which is why Rand Paul and others said, no, Big Brother really is watching you. But up until now, we haven't had the technology as effective as it is now in terms of surveillance technology. And so when you hear somebody say, look, it just would be just a whole lot more convenient for you to have information on your phone, because after all, if you're going to fly internationally, sometimes even if you're flying domestically, you need to show that you've had a vaccine. And of course, if you haven't had a vaccine, oh boy, you're really in trouble there. But even if you have, well, we might as well just add everything else. And of course, in China, they've been following your social media posts. They've looked at your place of employment, your credit cards, and all the rest. And then once you have a digitally controlled system, and of course China wants to have a digital yuan, basically a digital currency, then they can tell from start to finish how you spend your money. So this is why in some respects I've said this whole question of surveillance is going to have to be a part one, part two that we're going to cover in the future. But that's why you are launching that today, and hope you don't mind me being first out of the box to get our audience from all over the country to get involved. But you're encouraging people to go to the website. Of course, we already have a link there, so they can follow that, read about it, and if they want, they can sign the petition, or if nothing else, find out where their member of Congress stands on this issue, because what is being portrayed as something that would be convenient and innocuous, we've seen in China how it's used in some pretty awful ways, haven't we?
Yes, we have, and unfortunately, we don't have where every member of Congress stands on this, unfortunately. So, but what you can do is, and we would ask you, go on Point of View to get the link and sign the petition, because unless we have many tens of thousands of signatures, the more signatures we have, the greater the impact we're going to have. If we can say we have 10 million signatures, that's a lot better than saying we have 50 signatures. So please do this. And yes, it is a tool of surveillance. And the thing also is, Kerby, it's international. So, for example, the European Union is instituting vaccine passports for people who want to travel to Europe. And I was reading a release about that. And one of the things that they said is that they really want this to be a worldwide thing, so that it's standardized throughout the world. Well, China is a big part of that world. Yes. And so is all of our information going to be accessible to the Chinese Communist Party? So this is something that's really a concern.
Sure. Well, again, we're just about out of time. Let me just mention that it is the article, the second one we've posted here, Stop Vaccine Passports, just came out today. If you say, wait a minute, I want to learn a little bit more, there's a webinar tonight, 6 o'clock Eastern, and of course, you have to then figure out if you're in the Central Time Zone, Mountain, or Pacific, or even for those in Alaska. So it would be later in the afternoon today, or else I'm sure you'll be able to find it a little bit later, but it is moderated, by the way, by our good friend Frank Gaffney, and all that information is at our website, pointofview.net. Of course, you can also go to Women's Rights Without Frontiers, and we have that information as well. Reggie Littlejohn, thank you so very much for standing up for life and now standing up for privacy and surveillance. And it's great, as always, to have you on Point of View.
It's always an honor, Kerby, and thank you for your courageous stand on those issues as well.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to change topics a little bit, but it's certainly kind of very relevant. The Christian left, how liberal thought has hijacked the church. And we're going to spend an hour with Lucas Miles. Was going to do a short interview with him at the National Religious Broadcasters and said, no, this book's too good. It deserves an hour. And most importantly, I suspect some of you are going to have some comments. I don't know, maybe you think we should have vaccine passports. I doubt it. I think most of you think it's a bad idea. And I'm sure you're going to have some comments about some of the things we're going to say about the Christian left. So all that's coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about the book, The Christian Left, How Liberal Thought Has Hijacked the Church. And I think you're going to appreciate this book, which came out in May. About 4 pages of endorsements from all sorts of individuals that we have interviewed on this program. It is written by Lucas Miles. He is a writer, speaker, film producer, also the host of Faithwire's The Lucas Miles Show, co-host of the Church Boys podcast, been involved in church planting efforts, author of this book, but also I might also mention the book Good God, the One We Want to Believe in but Are Afraid to Embrace. He lives in Indiana, and he joins us now by phone.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
I might just mention we also have a link to lucasmiles.org, so if people would like to find out more about you, they can find it there. Of course, the book has been out, so I think most people should be able to find it in their local bookstore, but we also have a link in case people would like to get it in paperback or Kindle. And Lucas, really, we're talking about just the whole-scale redefinition of words, words like love, justice, gender, and a number of others. And so what you're trying to do is help us see how these liberal thoughts that come from a pluralistic culture, that come from maybe even a secularized culture, have made their way into the church. And as a result, we need to have a great deal of discernment to figure out what might even be coming from pulpits and from even other members of our church. So that's, in some respects, kind of a summary of what you've been trying to do in the book, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, there's been what the New York Times has called this ascendant liberal Christianity that has really manifested itself in things like critical race theory, wokeism, progressive Christianity, the support of, LGBT agendas, anti-biblical ideas about marriage, gender, sexuality, and sort of this reprogramming of today's youth to, I think, continue to drift towards these divergent dark waters of the left.
Might just mention, too, we have a link to your Facebook page. We have a link to your Twitter feed as well as your website. So all sorts of great material on the website, pointofview.net. Wanted to give it an hour. I thought it deserved a very long interview, 10 chapters. The first one is the idea of the Trojan horse. And this, I think, helps us understand that we're engaged in kind of theological warfare, or what you sometimes refer to as doctrinal deconstructionism, kind of a big set of words. But what you're talking about is that there is this takeover of many of these seminaries and pulpits of the churches, isn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen this, I think, for a while now. In the past, it was one sort of isolated within these academic centers where you found, very liberal theologians who had kind of abandoned the Word of God as an authoritative book or this book of an infallible Word of God in exchange for kind of the Bible just as a historic textbook. And after time, that went from these liberal institutions, and it drifted from the professor to the pastors who were being trained there, and now we're finding it in the pews.
Well, and the reason we see it in the pews, and probably even in the pastorate as well, is nobody wants to be called a racist or a bigot. And so there is just a lot of cultural pressure, especially if you're not rooted in God's Word, to kind of embrace some of these secular ideas. And so you've certainly looked at the fact that this isn't the first time we've had to address secular secularism. It is certainly a challenge that believers since the first century and all the way into when we had our first Christian emperor, Constantine, have had to address. And so this is why we probably need as much discernment here in the 21st century as believers did in the first century.
Yeah, there was an early church father named Irenaeus, and he wrote a book called Against Heresies. And in the book, it was written in 180 AD, and he was talking about the heresy of Gnosticism during the first century. And he said that the reason why the first century church struggled to refute Gnosticism is they didn't fully understand it. And I think we have the same thing today, that we don't fully understand, or most people don't fully understand things like critical theory, things like Marxism, things like progressivism or liberation theology. And so these ideas are able to sort of run rampant within the church, oftentimes unrecognized from the pulpit, because we're not always hearing them as they are, because we don't understand the doctrine. And so one thing I wanted to do with this book, The Christian Left, was really to help people understand this secularization of the church, this trend towards progressivism, so that they can be prepared to, refute these things, and most importantly, really, stay strong in their faith despite the opposition.
Again, The Christian Left, How Liberal Thought Has Hijacked the Church. It's by our good friends at Broad Street. And again, you can find information about that on, of course, the website for Lucas Miles, but we also have information at our website, pointofview.net. Well, one of the things I wanted to talk about before we take our first break is anchored to the truth. And I can tell, as I was telling some people, I know you're a visual learner because you have some great diagrams in here, even though it's radio. I wish more people would watch, because we do have cameras in studio, because if we had lots of people watching, I'd put some of your diagrams up. But just imagine one, and that is maybe you have a buoy floating out there in the ocean. Well, what keeps the buoy from just floating away? Well, it's anchored to something that is in the ground, into the ocean bottom. And so you say that the buoy is kind of like doctrine. Orthodoxy is the rope that connects you to Scripture. And so I love your illustration, belief in buoys, but what happens if that rope or that cable breaks and you no longer are actually connected? You're detached from the Word. And so in some respects, that's what you're really talking about. Even if you don't understand a false doctrine, if you understand a biblical doctrine, you'll begin to see the problems with a false doctrine. And Christ, the illustration we always love to use is oftentimes when they're training people in the Secret Service in counterfeit money, they learn all the details of genuine money so that you spot counterfeit money instantaneously. And so in some respects, the problem today is that we have such a high level of biblical illiteracy and we're not anchored to the Scriptures. Fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is something that is so critical. I mean, we saw during the rise of the seeker-sensitive movement, and although I'm thankful for the conversions that happened in that movement, the movement made a lot of converts but very few disciples. And so over time, you had, kind of the transition between the 80s and 90s. You had this opportunity for liberalism to be sort of projected onto the church through the form of this teaching called social justice, which is really just kind of a rebranding of what is known as liberation theology, which is sort of the Christianized version of critical theory, which of course traces all the way back to Marx and Hegel and other secular philosophers. So you have this invasion that's happened, what I call in the book this Trojan horse, that's kind of pulled that cable, if you will, of doctrine for a lot of people so tight that it's snapped. And the thing that I always look for is, how do people view the Word? How do people view the Scriptures? How do they view the Bible? If we view the Bible, if it's no longer a authoritative, infallible, inerrant book in our lives that is God-breathed, then there's very little opportunity to be able to utilize Scripture to bring people back to the truth. My first book, I addressed some of the problems of fundamentalism and legalism. And the second book, I'm looking at kind of the opposite side of that, of people drifting away. The problem is we have to come back to the Word of God as the source of truth in every situation.
Very good. Could take a break. We'll continue our friend Lucas Miles right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Are single-parent families just as good for children as two-parent families? Some of the headlines recently in newspapers and news magazines seem to say so. But all you have to do is look back at academic studies to see that, in nearly every case, two parents are better than one. One older family study deserves renewed attention. Dr. Patrick Fagan, using data from the National Survey of Children's Health, found two important factors. Children who grow up in an intact family and attend religious services do better than children who do not. There is a significant discrepancy between children who grew up in intact two-parent families and those who came from broken homes. They also found a similar discrepancy between those who attend religious services weekly and those who worship less frequently. They found that children in the former groups were 5 times less likely to repeat a grade, less likely to have behavior problems at home and school, and more likely to be cooperative and understanding of others' feelings. They also found that these differences held true even after controlling for family income and poverty, as well as for the parents' education level, race, and ethnicity. In essence, the study suggests that the best prescription for society is a stable family and family worship. In this environment, children thrive emotionally and achieve academically. You know, in a sense, the study is a flip side of studies that were published years ago about the impact of divorce on children. In my book, Christian Ethics in Plain Language, I talk about the 3 E's of negative impact of divorce. That would be emotional impact, educational impact, and economic impact. So whether you look at these positive studies or the earlier negative studies, you can see the importance of family and worship. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we continue our conversation today with Lucas Miles, How Liberal Thought Has Hijacked the Church. The book is entitled The Christian Left. And you perhaps have sat in a church and heard maybe the pastor, or maybe even as you were chatting with some people in the fellowship hall, and you get the sense that their definition of the gospel, their definition of justice, their definition of gender, maybe their definition of love isn't your view, and it isn't the biblical view. And so in some respects, that's why we are certainly focusing some time and attention today on this book, to help you get some discernment and to begin to say, you know, maybe this church, maybe this denomination, maybe this group of individuals I'm running with aren't necessarily anchored to the Bible. And that's exactly what Lucas Miles is talking about. And that kind of brings us to a redefinition of love. You have a whole chapter on the misguided love of the leftist. And I thought it was kind of interesting because you grew up with the children's book, The Giving Tree, but that was a way to just sort of get people's attention on the issue of love, sin, and the gospel. And this is, I think, one of the key kind of foundational chapters in your book.
Yeah, I think that, you know, love is something that is certainly, I think that the left and the progressives struggles with. You know, today's culture defines love as if you agree with me, you love me. If you disagree with me, you hate me. And in actuality, what, you know, we see from a biblical standpoint, the Bible teaches us that Jesus came in grace and truth, that this God in the flesh, the person of love, that he is manifest in both grace and truth. And so there is an aspect of this unconditional love, but it is unconditional love that is joined with a absolute truth that he is drawing us to. And when our life, when our morality, when our thoughts contradict the truth of who he is and the absolute truth of this universe, I believe that in love, he shows us that, reveals that, because his desire is to lead us deeper into the truth to where we can experience the greatest degree of his life, which means that there is still a thing called sin. There is still a thing called, depravity, and we have to be aware of this as believers. And I think that the Christian left has really missed this, and they've tried to redefine this to really suit their fancy.
At some point, those on the Christian left, or people that are maybe swept in all of this and haven't really thought about it, they've got a real problem with John 14:6. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. And it gets us into one of the key themes that runs through that. Those of us that teach in seminary use some big words, the inclusivity or the exclusivity of Christianity. But is Christianity and the path a narrow path, and only those who are actually giving their lives to Jesus Christ and recognize that they are in need of salvation because they're sinners, are those the only ones that are saved? Or, as you get pretty much from the Christian left, Jesus saves everybody? What about that?
Yeah, the message of the Christian left is certainly this inclusive message, and it's so much so that there are some that have drifted on into universalism, where everybody's saved. I mean, this throws back to an early heretical view that God's so good that even Satan gets redeemed. This view of universalism has always been objected by the church for the last 2,000 years. It doesn't line up with Scripture. And I think that when we look at the gospel, what we find is something that it's the truth and the paradox. It is both the most inclusive and exclusive message. Jesus died for the sins of the whole world. That is certainly inclusive. Anybody is available. Anybody can receive that. But the exclusive part of it is you have to receive it by grace through faith. So only those who receive his work on the cross by grace through faith are able to experience the benefits of it. So the gospel is both inclusive and exclusive.
One of the things I thought we might also focus on is one of your chapters talks about sovereignty and the socialist mindset. And certainly, Lucas, one of the things we talk about here on this program is I have a booklet I'm holding up right now that we did a while back on a biblical view of capitalism and socialism, which I certainly kind of help us understand that the Bible doesn't necessarily endorse an economic program, but if you start with biblical views like human nature and sin nature and a variety of other things, you can see the value of a free market and property rights. And so I even answer some of the questions that sometimes people have about capitalism. But then it occurred to me more recently that because we have so many prominent socialists, I also needed to write this little booklet that we have on socialism, answering all the arguments that people are making that indeed we should accept socialism, including one that you actually address as well, because there are many people that say, well, if you're a Christian, you really need to be a socialist, because after all, the Bible really teaches socialism. Now, I try to answer that in both those booklets, but what about this? Because the younger you are, the more likely you are to believe that socialism is at least equal to, if not preferable to, capitalism. And that's another way in which I think the Christian left have made their way into the church.
Yeah, I think this push towards socialism is something that it really slips in. And I can tell you myself, I'll be 42 years old. I started preaching at 17, but in my early years of ministry, I was really enamored by more of a, what I would call a socialist gospel in many ways. There was some popular Christian artists at that time that were sort of espousing certain things that seemed to imply this sort of utopian communist socialist sort of viewpoint. And I was enamored by that and almost got really drawn into that, and thankfully had some people that were able to help me see kind of the error of those things. But I think it's even stronger today. I think people today that those who are old enough to remember Mikhail Gorbachev, his words were Jesus was the first great socialist. And that's sort of what's being echoed by the left today. And you hear that from individuals like AOC and to some degree even Bernie Sanders and Biden and others, Pete Buttigieg, who was presidential candidate. And so there is this push towards trying to create this alchemy of Christianity and socialism to have those things live together. And in fact, there's a specific theology that's called liberation theology, which is really the combination of those two things. But that is being pushed more and more in the mainstream. It's being done under the name of social justice, but it's really just an escape from personal responsibility. And it really goes against foundational teachings of the gospel of personal stewardship, generosity, all of these things. Socialism removes personal responsibility and removes our ability to be able to act as unique agents in this earth to carry out God's purposes for us.
And one of the things, since you mentioned liberation theology, is kind of intriguing because our listeners that are Catholic are saying, okay, I felt that, I've understood that. We've seen how that has been addressed within the Catholic hierarchy sometimes. And when I was in graduate school, which was before you were even born, probably, because we were talking about that then. But what has happened is those ideas that were rooted maybe in Latin America and a few other places now have morphed into something that will show up in not just Catholic churches, but Protestant churches, not just mainline churches, but sometimes what we would consider to be evangelical churches. And so it's going to be, I think, even more incumbent upon the individuals that do have some kind of biblical orthodoxy to speak to some of those issues, and also the need for, especially the younger generation, to exercise some discernment, because if you've spent 4 years at a university hearing from professors that laud the values of socialism and contradict and criticize everything in the free market, you're going to try to maybe just harmonize the two instead of thinking about, as we mentioned just a minute ago, that if you're concerned about sin nature, about the last thing you want is for a few individuals at the top of a socialist experiment to tell you what you see, read, and hear, what you eat, and how you live.
So there's two types of liberation theology. It was sort of two fingers of it, if you will. The first was, what you referred to, this that kind of arose out of Catholicism. There was a guy named Gutierrez in Latin America who sort of combined Catholic faith with Marxism in order to form liberation theology. In America, that took a little bit different form, and it's a little bit more of a radical version. One of the fathers of liberation theology in America was a guy named James Cone, and he taught some very explicit things about God, that God hates some people, that He loves other people, that really dividing people based upon issues of race and nationality, really push people away from a literal contextual view of Scripture for more of an allegorical use of it. He had all sorts of, kind of extreme ideas, even to some degree, I would argue, proposing violence as a response to, some of the oppressions and things that we see in this world. And so I think that we have to be very careful with where we're getting this information. And this is part of the problem, because we have pastors today that they don't know anything about liberation theology. They don't know anything about Marxism, but they hear somebody say something. They go, well, that sounds good. That sounds interesting. They start espousing it from the pulpit. They don't realize that they're bringing a watered-down version of really Marxism from the pulpit, and that's working its way into the congregation. It's why it's so important that we're informed and that we learn these things.
Well, let's take a break, and we will continue our conversation with Lucas Miles, how liberal thought has hijacked the church, the Christian left. We have covered a number of the chapters. We'll cover a few others, but if you'd like to join us at any point, 1-800-351-1212. All sorts of information about him and the book on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today about the Christian left. And if you'd like to join the conversation, we'll get to some of those phone calls in just a minute. 1-800-351-1212. 1-800-351-1212. How liberal thought hijacked the church. And one of the things that I think, Lucas, some of our listeners might be thinking, if they're a Sunday school teacher, a small group leader, a pastor, is, how could I teach this? First of all, you have a series of questions in the back, so this could be something something you could do as a small group study. But if you wanted to preach a sermon, you have in chapter 5 what are called the 3 temptations of the church. And what you do is take the 3 temptations of Jesus, turning stones into bread, and then show how that connects to some of the issues there. Then the whole idea of the innocence of man and throwing yourself off of the temple. And then the final one in terms of showing you all the kingdoms and salvation redefined. And you have kind of a format that would allow you to kind of do a kind of a biblical exegesis, but then make the connections to some of the things we've already talked about, whether it's liberation theology or universalism.
Hey, I appreciate that. I mean, that's a real compliment. I've had a lot of pastors that have actually been using this within their churches, and they're getting great feedback. I actually just did a series here because I'm still a pastor myself with a local church, and I just did a series here recently with for about 5 or 6 weeks, really teaching through what I called the attack on orthodoxy, which was sort of a companion teaching series related to a lot of the themes of the book. There's also a story later on where I take the account of Solomon with the 2 women that approach him with an argument about who's the real mother of the baby,
right,
when the other child had been killed. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of things that people can pull from. I actually just heard recently from a university that's using the book now as part of their curriculum, which I thought was a real just honor there as well.
Well, let's take some phone calls. 1-800-351-1212. We'll head up to Maine. And Keith, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Yeah, how you doing? Yeah, I've been a missionary planting churches in Manila, Philippines, among the poor, and we a lot about.
Go ahead. Do we lose you? Maybe we lost you. I guess we lost him. Sorry about that. Maybe he can call back, but I think he was questioning whether or not sometimes he says the evangelical church sees things with rose-colored glasses. And that's a concern, because if we say, well, we're concerned about social justice and the way it's been manipulated and used, it seems to me that people then naturally say, well, then you're not concerned about justice for the poor. But I think you come to a different conclusion. Now I think we got Keith back here again. Keith, let you finish the rest of your sentence there. Well, we're having some
missionary.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, being a missionary among the poor, I just find sometimes even how we look at history, we're wearing rose-colored glasses, and we don't deal with it honestly. Like, I worked in the black church, and I learned so much of what it was to be black in America that I just didn't know. And so sometimes I think we're so isolated, and we come across as being hypocritical. And I think there's plenty of time to be personally responsible, but we also need to be corporately responsible. And I think people are looking for genuine faith where believers are willing to lay down their lives because they love the Lord so much and love people rather than protecting themselves so much, which the evangelical church seems to be so much about protecting oneself, going to fight wars maybe because, and they demonize the socialists as they want to fight wars and their reason why is bad, but our reason's good. It comes across as hypocritical a lot of times. So I think, we got to love Jesus, love people, but we got to be willing to really sacrifice our lives, not live for the 401k and not put capitalism, which there's a lot of good things about. I'm a business owner, a lot of good things about capitalism, but it's not all good. There's a lot of greed, a lot of sin, and I don't think Jesus would necessarily be a socialist, but I don't think he would be a capitalist either,
Okay, I think you've got some good points. Any thoughts about that, Lucas?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, first off, we have to really face the fact socialism has been responsible for the death of over 100 million people worldwide. 100 million people. And so I think that there's this kind of push in our society today to almost, if we're talking about rose-colored glasses, that we're failing to see the real horrors of socialism. It is a horrific framework. It is responsible not just for death, but also poverty and all sorts of problems across the world. And especially within the last 100 years, really, since we've seen it on this scale. Additionally, I think that there is something I would agree with, that we have a tendency, because there's such a pushback against kind of the wrong views of social justice within the evangelical world. We do have an issue that I identify in this book that I call this cycle of worry, anger, and apathy that exists on the right. And I think that, just because we're criticizing social justice does not give us a permission as believers to not do anything. The love of God should compel us to go out, and there are ways to help the poor, feed those in need, clothe those in need, to do that in a way through the gospel rather than through a socialist lens or a liberation theology lens. And I also encourage people to get good history. There's groups like Wall Builders and, groups that are really exposing things like the 1619 Project and some of the revisionist history that's happening out there, making sure that we really have good information as if we're going to look back and judge history as a result.
Since you kind of picked on that for a minute, I might jump ahead because one of your chapters is the right, and the questions that you have been up until now talking about have been looking at, if you will, the Christian left. What about the Christian right? Because, I think that's a little bit of the question that Keith is raising, and whether we've, as you said, have too much freedom, maybe are a little too comfortable. The word compassion means we should have passion with them, with passion, and this idea of compassion really comes from the idea of being willing to lay down our lives and to minister and serve others. So what about that? Because you do have a whole chapter that addresses that as well.
Yeah, I think that we have, things that we need to address with those, within the rights and the insult culture, the Twitter wars, the memes, all these sorts of things. Is there examples of Christian nationalism? I think overall Christian nationalism is a straw man argument. I'm sure there's some pockets of people that tend to lean towards this. The bigger issue within, I think a framework of biblical Christians is that, oftentimes they're just not really committed to their faith. They're not sold out. And so they might have agreement with a biblical worldview, but they're not really have made Jesus Lord of their life all the time. And so we see that hypocrisy that kind of rises up that people identify. The difference between, say, something like those who, maybe, espouse capitalism versus those who espouse socialism, things like socialism and critical theory, they have statements about the Bible. They have statements about God. They're trying to redefine the nature of Christianity to secularize it. Capitalism is just benign to Christianity. It doesn't have a thought about it. It doesn't have an agenda. It's not trying to do propaganda about what is faith and what isn't faith. It's just people that are running the free market. And so this is why the free market, although we do have examples of people who work in greed and everything else, is always a better choice because it allows for religion to be religion and the market to be the market, where socialism and communism and these things are really trying to come in and create a state that is usurping the role of the church and creating the church that's subservient to the state.
Let's take some more phone calls. We'll head to Georgia, WLPE. Fran, you're on with Lucas Miles.
I love what you're saying, but I think we're missing a very basic point here. Most of the time, socialism says we're all good, and if you just give everybody the same amount of money and stuff to begin with, we're all going to turn out fine. Whereas Christianity recognizes that we're all sinners, and we have to take that in consideration no matter what we do.
Sounds good to me. And again, that's part of it, because if people say, look, I don't want somebody running my life, that's one of the questions I often have. We have a millennial roundtable, Lucas. Maybe we should have you join it sometimes, even though you're a little bit older than some of the ones around the table, because I'll have a millennial say, I don't really like people telling me what to do, but I like socialism. Woo, a category mistake here. If you don't want people telling you what to do, then you don't want to go down that road called socialism. And socialism is based upon a false view of human nature, this utopian view of human nature. So in some respects, your earlier chapter dealing with trying to get our doctrine straight about about grace and about salvation and about sin relates a little bit later to the chapter that you address on the issue of socialism, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the caller will be pleased to know that I do address that within the book, that one of the issues that we have with the left is really a total abandonment of the doctrine of original sin and human depravity. And so this is why this leftist view is so associated with something like Marxism. Marxism teaches essentially that everyone is good. It's just the system that is bad. So until we fix the system, we can't talk about anybody's personal issues. And so the idea of personal responsibility and sin and all that stuff is just removed completely. We have the same thing that is happening within, I think, progressive Christianity. In fact, things like liberation theology would say that you're not even allowed to address the sin within an individual until you fix the system. And of course, we know that is completely against scriptural.
We'll take a break and we'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Lucas Miles with us as we talk about his book, The Christian Left. And there are a couple chapters I thought we might focus on before we run out of time. And one of those chapters is chapter 9, Discerning the Truth. If there is a word I've been using quite a bit this last year, it's the need for us to have discernment. And then, of course, you have a chapter on the sacrifice of love. And in some respects, what this really requires is that we need to be anchored to God's Word. We need to actually begin to ask good questions. And we need to develop biblical discernment at a time when there's a great deal of theological confusion, don't you think?
Absolutely. I think that we have a lot of confusion right now. And that tends to happen after you have periods of extreme conflict between two different sides. And so there enters in this time of skepticism. And we can trace it back through philosophy. We've seen that happen in a number of kind of periods of time. I think right now it's even more complicated because of, trouble to find good news sources and so much, kind of just false, just noise out there, I think, by media and everything else that's happening. And so I think a lot of Christians are just confused. And so during these times, it's so important that we come back to Scripture. We come back to orthodoxy. Christianity is a well-defined faith. It's been here for 2,000 years. We have a very clear book that is authoritative and infallible that we call the Bible. And we have the witness of the Holy Spirit on the inside of us, as well as the accountability of the body of believers. These are all things we need to draw back to and not be taken really captive by these new ideas that are being espoused so many times through progressivism.
You mentioned just a few minutes ago, and this is in this chapter, where Solomon was confronted by two women who claimed a baby, and so the idea was to cut the baby in two. And as soon as he ordered that, then the true mother came forward. But you have this kind of mindset and this kind of, if you will, tool on actually what it means to cut the baby in two. Because what you have to do, I think, is the deal with the need to address the fact that the Christian left in particular and the secular left have really tried to separate the whole nation from biblical principles.
I think that's, for me, it just was such a story that explained what was happening so clearly right now. As we have this decision, of Solomon trying to judge between these two women, he does the unthinkable thing. He calls for a sword. And the true mother, said, no, she can have the child if that's what it means. The other mom was willing to have the baby cut in half just because she didn't have her own. And when you look at people who are willing to just dissect the word, to cross verses out, to maybe just, dismantle the word entirely, you start understanding a little bit more about who the true curators of truth is. And not that those who hold to a biblical worldview have a perfect view of truth or of God, but I believe that, where we stand in our allegiance to the fullness of the Scriptures, I think says a lot about our faith.
And again, I think that was just another tool for your discernment toolbox. But one other one, and this is the 10th chapter in your 10-chapter book, The Sacrifice of Love. And we were sort of alluding to some of that just a few minutes ago. But what does love mean according to the Bible? What does love mean according to the teaching of Jesus? What does love mean in terms of the early church compared to the way love has been redefined today, redefined in the modern church?
Yeah, what we see, Jesus is the manifestation, really, of love to the world. We see a selfless love in him. We see a sacrificing love in him. We see a love that is focused more on our eternal future than our material needs. But within this, we also see some very hard words that are spoken. It's not just this hippie version of love that is so often, painted in context of Jesus. We see Jesus speak out against things that are untrue, against heresies. We see Paul warn the early church against specific people that were coming in, trying to draw them away from the truth. And so, again, love comes in grace and truth. That's the manifestation that we see Jesus in. And anytime we get into grace without truth, we will find our way into some sort of, kind of elevation of freedom, if we or licentiousness in the extreme. And if we just go to truth without grace, we'll find ourselves in legalism. The only way to stay really rooted on a biblical worldview is to uphold both grace and truth.
And again, you have near the back ways to get involved, 6 points. And then 10 points, is your church part of the Christian left? Questions to consider. So I think it is put together in a way that is very user-friendly. And even those questions could be part of a small group study or a Bible study or something else. But Lucas, just before we wind down, let me, if I can, encourage people to go to our website, pointofview.net. Click on the button there that says lucasmiles.org, or they can just go directly to the website, either way. And first of all, what they're going to find is a little bit more about your podcasts and some of those resources. Of course, they can get a book there as well. And then they can contact you. I suspect some might like you to come and speak, or to hold a conference, or a variety of other topics that are available. So there is information there about speaking. There is, of course, a way in which you can support the ministries that you have been a part of. And there is also a way in which people can follow your podcast. So just real briefly, talk about what is available on your website if they land there.
Yeah, so I'm all over the country this summer speaking about the dangers of the Christian left and progressive Christianity, so they can find tour dates and dates where I'm going to be in Florida, California, Ohio, South Carolina, all over the place. Also, if they get a book at lucasmiles.org, whether it's my first book, Good God, or this book, The Christian Left, all copies I'm sending out, my team is sending out that are autographed from me. And so if they want an autographed copy, they can buy direct from me. If not, the book is available on Amazon and all the other platforms that they can get as well. But appreciate people signing up for my mailing list, staying in touch. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share about this work.
Well, again, you're hoping that people will take this book and maybe read it individually, but I have been a couple of times suggesting to those who are like you, either a pastor or maybe they're a small group leader, a Bible fellowship leader, Sunday school leader, something like that. You really could teach through these 10 chapters, and you've been able to do it in your church, so maybe they could contact you and find out a little bit more how they could do it in their church.
Absolutely. And, we've had a lot of people grab a hold of this. There are already Bible studies that are popping up and small groups that are using material and classrooms that are using the material. So we're here to help with that any way that we can. If people want to get the book in bulk, they can contact us directly for some special deals for bulk sales to be able to get those out to their churches or organizations. And also for any organizations that are listening that maybe align with our values, we have the ability for an affiliate program where they can, really use the book as a fundraiser for their ministry. So that's something unique that we're doing.
Very good. Lucas, thank you so very much for giving us an hour today. Thank you for writing the book, and look forward to a future opportunity.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
The theme that has run through so much of this year is the need for us to have discernment. This is another very good tool that you can put in your discernment toolbox and learn a little bit more about some of the threats, some of the key buzzwords, some of the impact that this is having on churches and denominations. So it is one of the reasons why I really wanted to give it an hour and to have you really, in a sense, hear all sorts of aspects of this book. And even over an hour, we have only covered some of the chapters, but at least enough to give you a very good feel for what is in it. And so I do commend it to you. Just before we say goodbye today, let's recognize that we have posted quite a number of articles for you to read today. You can find out more about Reggie Littlejohn, Lucas Miles. You can find some of the articles I mentioned at the beginning of the program. And of course, we have my Viewpoints commentary today. It's all available for you at pointofview.net. Don't forget that tomorrow is our Friday weekend edition. I postponed a couple of really important stories to that discussion, and that will be with Penna Dexter and Dr. Merrill Matthews. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.